Greetings, my dear colleagues, members, and friends of the Chinese Language Division at American Translators Association. Welcome to another exciting episode of our division podcast. I'm your host, Jessie. Can you believe that we are already at the halfway point of 2025? By my observation, in the language service space, AI still remains the ongoing concern for us. While it is pretty hard to steal that thunder, something else did make quite the splash in the TNI world. By the time you're listening to this podcast, the splash making event is already a thing of many news cycles ago. Yes, you guessed it. It is the signing of the executive order that made English the official language of the United States. It also seemed to have caused some doubt and uncertainty in our line of work. And why am I just talking about it now? Well, because I feel that sometimes we have a clearer understanding of the issue when the dust has settled a little, so that we're able to approach it without our judgment being clouded by emotions, so that we can understand what it is and what it isn't, and whether that's something worthy of our time and energy to worry about, or simply flip the page over and move on. In order to get that clarity, I have the best guest for you today, and that is Dr. Bill Rivers. Dr. Rivers is a former Russian English translator and interpreter, Russian teacher, academic researcher and administrator, and for-profit and nonprofit executive. He has more than 30 years experience in language advocacy at the national level, with significant work in language access, culture, and language for economic development and national security. Dr. Rivers has publications in second and third language acquisition research, proficiency assessment, program evaluation, and language policy development and advocacy. Now, I will let Bill take it over and say hi.
Hi, and thank you, Jessie, for inviting me to the podcast. I'm Dr. Bill Rivers, principal of WP Rivers and Associates. I've been working for the last 15 years as an advocate, lobbyist, and now consultant for everything to do with language at the national level and working with the Congress and the executive branch.
Welcome to the show, Bill. Let's start off by having you give us the A to Z on the not so recently signed executive order making English the official language.
Yeah, so this is Executive Order 14224, which was signed on March 1st by President Trump. And it has three major components. The first is a declaration that English is the official language. The second is the revocation of Executive Order 13166, which I know we're going to talk about. And the third has to do with revoking guidance that was developed under that executive order. So you come back to English as the official language. The United States has never had a de jure official language. It's not in our Constitution, and there's no federal law saying that English is the official language. Unlike, say, Canada, where English and French have equal status, or Kazakhstan, where both Kazakh and Russian are in the Constitution. And there are many countries that have this kind of setup with either the Constitution specifying an official language or a federal national law saying that. But we've never had it. Now, you could say, oh, this isn't a big deal because we're just recognizing the facts on the ground that English has been the de facto official language of the United States since July 4th, 1776. That sounds reasonable, doesn't it? And yeah, maybe, but there are a couple of points you have to consider. The first is not only do we not have an official language, we have 100 years of Supreme Court case law, cases like Meyer versus Nebraska in 1923, where in 1919, the state of Nebraska, under something called the Simon Act or Siman Act, S-I-M-A-N, don't know how to pronounce it, outlawed the teaching of foreign languages to children younger than 8th grade, did a whole bunch of other things. As part of the backlash against the perceived alien enemies during the First World War, there was a lot of backlash against especially Germany. The Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. You can't outlaw the teaching of a language. You can't. And subsequent cases at the Supreme Court level, state Supreme Courts, federal appellate courts, over the last 100 years have said, without a really compelling reason, the government cannot restrict the use of languages
Mm.
as for teaching, whether instruction through the language or in the language, whether in the workplace, on a school campus. It's a violation of civil rights to tell Chinese kids who speak Putonghua to say you can't talk to each other, speak English in front of me. If they're
Right.
not in the classroom. Now, in English class, you can say, yeah, you got to answer in English, sure. So the first point is that we've never really needed an official language. The government has always operated in English. And in fact, we've had language access going back in federal case law to at least the 1920s under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So the first analysis, you say, okay, is this really necessary? And it does seem to contradict existing laws and practice. But the second point about English as the official language, it comes from a particularly unpleasant part of our recent history in the United States. The organizations that promote English only, the most vocal organizations, the best organized, the best funded, are themselves pretty virulently anti-immigrant, white supremacist, eugenicist, and so on, in varying degrees.
Mm-hmm.
And even if, say, the modern English only movement started in the late 70s in California with Senator Hayakawa from San Francisco, as a reaction, in fact, to Lau versus Nichols, the case that the Supreme Court decided unanimously that language discrimination is equivalent to and part of national origin-based discrimination. So we need language access. And language access, as I mentioned, also goes back a long ways. It was certainly strengthened by Lau versus Nichols. It was strengthened again by Executive Order 13166. But the English-only folks are also part of that. Now, they've been very careful to say, at least in the executive order, that we're not taking anybody's rights away. That comes to the last point about executive orders. An executive order isn't law. It's not like a decree from the throne or an ukaz, as we used to say in Russian, from the czar. It is an executive order. Yeah. So it binds only the people who are employees of the executive branch or who might receive funding from the executive branch to the extent that executive order doesn't conflict with federal law. Mm-hmm. And that's explicit in every executive order. There's boilerplate at the end say we're not creating or taking away rights. Nothing here establishes law. Nothing here can contravene existing law. So you can declare it the official language doesn't mean that it actually is in any legal sense. Just like saying renaming a geographical feature, I could call it the Gulf of Bill. You don't have to call it the Gulf of Bill. Okay, so now I got to call it the Gulf of America, but nobody in Mexico or Cuba or Belize is going to call it that. And now we have to use English only? No, it doesn't really affect the day-to-day in and of itself. Now, there are a whole bunch of other executive orders about immigration and dealing with border crises and birthright citizenship, and a whole bunch of other executive orders about DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, whatever that is, because there's no actual definition anywhere in the law. And there are all these other things that the government that the administration and DOGE have done, shutting down the Office of English Language Acquisition in the Department of Education, closing the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties in the Department of Homeland Security, closing the Office of Minority Health in the Department of Health and Human Services. And when you step back and say, okay, here's this pattern, this mosaic of things that are clearly aimed at making the lives of immigrants, documented or undocumented, much more uncomfortable. And the concern that people in the language access world have is that it's not just that English only bit and the revocation of the Executive Order 13166. It's everything taken together is going to have a chilling effect. And we'll see kids not going to school because the parents are afraid that they'll be separated if there's a raid on the workplace and the parents are grabbed. Or people not going to the doctor's office for appointments because they're afraid there'll be raids there and they might be caught up by immigration authorities. And we're starting to see some of that. I think first and foremost in the schools, we're seeing anecdotal evidence of immigrants avoiding regular medical attention. So you have to step back and say it's all of a broader pattern. And yes, this is the most visible piece to us in the language world. Yeah. But it's all part of a broader pattern. And this is whether or not you believe that we have to do something about immigration, we have too many undocumented people here or not, or how best to deal with that. The reality is still that somebody shows up in the emergency room, they get treated. Doesn't matter what their status is. Tourist, citizen, permanent resident, undocumented, they still get treated. Yeah. Children in school, every child in the United States documented or otherwise, whatever their immigration or citizenship status is, has the right to an education under a different Supreme Court law. And that hasn't changed. And so we still have the legal obligation to do these things, to treat patients, to educate children, the moral obligation, in my view, to do these things, and the very practical question of you can't do that without language access.
Thank you for that extensive background on Executive Order 14224, which designated English as the official language of the United States and also revoked Executive Order 13166, which had previously required federal agencies to provide language assistance to individuals with limited English proficiency. My next question is, you mentioned that an executive order isn't law and it cannot contravene existing law, including the case law established by Supreme Court cases, and you gave a couple of examples. So does that mean for those of us working to provide language assistance to the community, the jobs are still there, just like before?
Legally, they should still be there. Language access is still the law of the land. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is still in force. It's still on the books.
Yeah.
And all the regulations that implement it are still on the books. Bao versus Nichols, 1974 Supreme Court case where Cantonese-speaking families sued the San Francisco Unified School District for not providing an equal education based on the language that the children spoke.
Yeah.
That is still in force. It was a unanimous decision, 9-0. The Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act, which covers non-discrimination in healthcare, applies to nearly every healthcare provider in the U.S. Doctor, pharmacy, hospital, outpatient clinic, physical therapist, dentist, etc. That is still in effect, and the regulations that implement it are still in effect. The Joint Commission on Hospital Accreditation, and I always get the acronym wrong, I'm sorry, they require language access plans and policies in order for medical facilities to be accredited.
Yep.
And if your medical facility has to be accredited in order to take any federal funding, so that's Medicare and Medicaid, which is half or more of the patients in the US are on either Medicare or Medicaid. So it's still the law of the land. Language access is still required in all of the places it was once required. Denying it is still a violation of civil rights. So in principle, all of the same job opportunities should still be there. Now, we are getting anecdotal reports of patients being turned away and told to come back tomorrow with an interpreter. Anecdotal, so far unverified. But yes, it's still the law of the land. And in fact, just last week, I think on the 15th, the Department of Justice issued a notice in the Federal Register saying it's going to revise the guidance on language access because of this, the President Trump's executive order. But at the very end, it says, as a reminder, you still have your obligations to provide language access. Nothing has changed in that regard.
This is reassuring and good to hear for sure. A while back, you led a team of colleagues to speak with the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. What prompted you to do that, and what message did you have for them?
So with the Civil Rights Commission, because that was about 3 weeks after, I wanted to lay out a lot of the things I just laid out to you, that it's language access is still the law of the land, that English as the official language sounds benign, but actually I don't think it is. When we did our Hill Day, which was also after the executive order, so the Association of Language Companies on the Hill, which is a virtual lobbying day, virtual since ALC started it in 2021. ATA did a Capitol Hill Day when ATA met in Washington last, which I think was like 2017, 2018. But we go up making the case for language access, among other things, in terms of language access.
Yeah.
And there's the civil rights dimension, which I've talked about. There's, for many of us, a moral dimension to it, an ethical dimension of how we treat other people and provide them with a fair shot at whatever they're going through. Then there's the very practical dimension. There are 75 million, at least 75 million people in the United States who speak a language other than English at home. And roughly 25 to 26 million are classified by the census as limited English proficient. There are another 5 million or so deaf and hard of hearing. And so that's 80 million people who need some kind of language access all the time in all sorts of different contexts. And you can't, so you have to be accreditation for hospitals, civil rights requirements, legal requirements. You cannot treat a patient, you can't sell a product or a service. You can't give a speeding ticket. You can't issue a permit to have a quinceañera in the local park unless you can communicate with the people on the other side of the situation.
Yeah.
And it's just a very practical thing. And so we have had historically bipartisan support for language access. It's wobbled a little bit on one side of the aisle recently, again, because of recent political events, but historically bipartisan support. And we've been very successful in getting funding, for example, for universal language access symbol. The future of that's unclear since the office that was supposed to create it no longer exists. Money's still there. And the real point isn't the symbol. You think of a handicap symbol, something that would be iconic and obvious. It's a little harder with languages. It's easy to make something that's iconic, but have it to actually impart the meaning of language access is a little tougher.
Yeah.
The real value of that project would be the education campaign, so that limited English proficient populations in the U.S., individuals, communities, would be more assertive in demanding their rights. And the people who are supposed to provide those language access rights would know more about it.
Mm-hmm.
Unlike the deaf and hard of hearing community, which is much more assertive in demanding its rights. I don't think the service providers are any necessarily much better about providing those rights to communications access.
Yeah.
And there are different reasons for that. The vast majority of deaf and hard of hearing people aren't worried about the migration status, the immigration. Yeah. But even when you look at the LEP population in the U.S., the estimate is at least 80% are here as citizens, permanent residents, or have some other legal status in the U.S. So there's also this, when it comes back to how we have characterized language access, I think, and even communications access for generations, is that we're doing this primarily for the disadvantaged, be they lower SES immigrants, be they deaf and hard of hearing, whereas in fact we're doing it for both sides of the conversation. And I think that part of that, because when you turn it into an issue of solely of minoritized communities, then it's much easier to attack that. That is still true. It's still absolutely essential. But I think we have to remember it's a dyad. There are two parties to every conversation, and we have to remember that we're enabling that other party,
right,
to succeed.
Do you think that message was well received? Do you think our policymakers are receptive to what we're seeing in the field every day?
Almost all of them. Just a few at the White House, and those folks really matter. And I say that because there's a history there, and we were concerned that the previous Trump administration would overturn 13166. It didn't. We held our breath for 4 years.
Yeah.
But this administration came in and did. Not sure what the effects are really going to be. As I said earlier, just to sum it up, there may be some chilling effects, but it's still the law of the land.
Well, thank you so much, Bill, for sharing everything with us. Not only it is a great insight, but also it provides clarity. There is one last thing I want to do, and that's to express my gratitude for all the advocacy work you have done, especially the recent effort you led to meet with the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights to explain to them the importance of language access. You are a great role model and a source of inspiration for many.
Couldn't do it without everyone doing their work. And the most important thing in advocacy is bring passion to your work. And make your work important to you and to the people that you serve. That's the first step in advocacy.
With that parting wisdom, I'm going to bid you farewell and thank you once again for your time with us today. Thank you, Bill.